Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
Once upon a time in the middle of winter, when the flakes of snow were falling like feathers from the clouds, a queen sat at her palace window, which had an ebony black frame, stitching her husband's shirts. While she was thus engaged and looking out at the snow, she pricked her finger, and 3 drops of blood fell upon the snow. Now the red looked so well upon the white that she thought to herself,
"Oh, that I had a child as white as this snow, as red as this blood, and as black as the wood of this frame."
Soon afterwards a little daughter came to her, who was as white as snow, and with cheeks as red as blood, and with hair as black as ebony, and from this she was named Snow White. And at the same time her mother died. About a year afterwards the king married another wife, who was very beautiful, but so proud and haughty that she could not bear anyone to be better looking than herself. She owned a wonderful mirror, and when she stepped before it and said,
"Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of us all?"
it replied,
"The queen is the fairest of the day."
Then she was pleased, for she knew that the mirror spoke truly. Little Snow White, however, grew up, and became prettier and prettier, and when she was 7 years old she was as fair as the noonday, and more beautiful than the queen herself. When the queen now asked her mirror,
"Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of us all?"
it replied,
"The queen is the fairest of the day. Snow White is the fairest, now, they say."
This answer so angered the queen that she became quite yellow with envy. From that hour, whenever she saw Snow White, her heart was hardened against her, and she hated the little girl. Her envy and jealousy increased so that she had no rest day or night, and she said to a huntsman,
"Take the child away into the forest. I will never look upon her again. You must kill her, and bring me her heart and tongue for a token."
The huntsman listened and took the maiden away, but when he drew out his knife to kill her, she began to cry, saying,
"Ah, dear huntsman, give me my life. I will run into the wild forest, and never come home again."
This speech softened the hunter's heart, and her beauty so touched him that he had pity on her and said,
"Well, run away then, poor child."
But he thought to himself,
"The wild beasts will soon devour you."
Still he felt as if a stone had been lifted from his heart, because her death was not by his hand. Just at that moment a young boar came roaring along to the spot, and as soon as he clapped eyes upon it the huntsman caught it, and, killing it, took its tongue and heart and carried them to the queen, for a token of his deed. But now poor little Snow White was left motherless and alone, and overcome with grief, she was bewildered at the sight of so many trees, and knew not which way to turn. She ran till her feet refused to go farther, and as it was getting dark, and she saw a little house near, she entered in to rest. In this cottage everything was very small, but very neat and elegant. In the middle stood a little table with a white cloth over it, and 7 little plates upon it, each plate having a spoon and a knife and a fork, and there were also 7 little mugs. Against the wall were 7 little beds arranged in a row, each covered with snow-white sheets. Little Snow White, being both hungry and thirsty, ate a little morsel of porridge out of each plate, and drank a drop or 2 of wine out of each mug, for she did not wish to take away the whole share of anyone. After that, because she was so tired, She laid herself down on one bed, but it did not suit. She tried another, but that was too long, a fourth was too short, a fifth too hard. But the seventh was just the thing, and tucking herself up in it, she went to sleep, first saying her prayers as usual. When it became quite dark, the owners of the cottage came home, 7 dwarfs, who dug for gold and silver in the mountains. They first lighted 7 little lamps, and saw at once, for they lit up the whole room, that somebody had been in, for everything was not in the order in which they had left it. The first asked,
"Who has been sitting on my chair?"
The second,
"Who has been eating off my plate?"
The third said,
"Who has been nibbling at my bread?"
The fourth,
"Who has been at my porridge?"
The fifth,
"Who has been middling with my fork?"
The sixth grumbled out.
"Who has been cutting with my knife?"
The seventh said. Then the first, looking round, began again.
"Who has been lying on my bed?"
He asked, for he saw that the sheets were tumbled. At these words the others came, and looking at their beds cried out too.
"Someone has been lying in our beds."
But the 7th little man, running up to his, saw Snow White sleeping in it, so he called his companions, who shouted with wonder and held up their 7 lamps, so that the light fell upon the little girl.
Oh, heavens! Oh, heavens! What a beauty she is!
And they were so much delighted that they would not awaken her, but left her to sleep, and the 7th dwarf, in whose bed she was, slept with each of his fellows 1 hour, and so passed the night. As soon as morning dawned, Snow White awoke, and was quite frightened when she saw the 7 little men, but they were very friendly, and asked her what she was called.
My name is Snow White,
Was her reply.
"Why have you come into our cottage?"
They asked. Then she told them how her stepmother would have had her killed, but the huntsman had spared her life, and how she had wandered about the whole day until at last she had found their house. When her tale was finished, the dwarf said,
"Will you look after our household, be our cook, make the beds, wash, sew, and knit for us, and keep everything in neat order? If so, we will keep you here, and you shall want for nothing."
And Snow White answered,
yes, with all my heart and will.
and so she remained with them, and kept their house in order. In the morning the dwarfs went into the mountains and searched for silver and gold, and in the evening they came home and found their meals ready for them. During the day the maiden was left alone, and therefore the good dwarfs warned her and said,
"Be careful of your stepmother, who will soon know of your being here. So let nobody enter the cottage."
The queen meanwhile, supposing that she had eaten the heart and tongue of her stepdaughter, believed that she was now above all the most beautiful woman in the world. One day she stepped before her mirror, and said,
"Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of us all?"
It replied,
"The queen is the fairest of the day. Snow White is the fairest, now, they say. The dwarfs protect her from thy sway. Amid the forest, far away."
This reply surprised her, but she knew that the mirror spoke the truth. She knew, therefore, that the huntsman had deceived her, and that Snow White was still alive. So she dyed her face and clothed herself as a peddler woman, so that no one could recognize her, and in this disguise she went over the 7 hills to the house of the 7 dwarfs. She knocked at the door of the hut, and called out. Snow White peeped out of the window and said,
Good day, my good woman, what have you to sell?
Fine goods, beautiful goods. Stays of all colors.
And she held up a pair which were made of many-colored silks.
I may let in this honest woman,
thought Snow White, and she unbolted the door and bargained for one pair of stays.
You can't think, my dear, how they become you. Come, let me lace them up for you.
Snow White suspected nothing, and let her do as she wished, but the old woman laced her up so quickly and so tightly that all her breath went, and she fell down like one dead. Now, thought the old woman to herself, hastening away,
now am I once more the most beautiful of all.
At eventide, not long after she had left, the 7 dwarfs came home, and were much frightened at seeing their dear little maid lying on the ground, and neither moving nor breathing, as if she were dead. They raised her up, and when they saw that she was laced too tight they cut the stays to pieces, and presently she began to breathe again, and little by little she revived. When the dwarfs now heard what had taken place, they said,
The old peddler woman was no other than your wicked stepmother. Take more care of yourself, and let no one enter when we are not with you.
Meanwhile, the queen had reached home, and, going before her mirror, she repeated her usual words.
Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of us all?
It replied,
The queen is the fairest of the day. Snow White is the fairest, now, they say. The dwarfs protect her from thy sway. Amid the forest, far away.
As soon as it had finished, all her blood rushed to her heart, for she was so angry to hear that Snow White was yet living. But now, thought she to herself,
Will I make something which shall destroy her completely?
Thus saying, she made a poison comb by arts which she understood, and then, disguising herself, she took the form of an old widow. She went over the 7 hills to the house of the 7 dwarfs, and knocking at the door, called out,
You must go farther, for I dare not let you in.
Snow White peeped out and said,
But still you may look,
said the old woman, drawing out her poison comb and holding it up. The sight of this pleased the maiden so much that she allowed herself to be persuaded, and opened the door. As soon as she had bought something the old woman said,
Now let me for once comb your hair properly.
And Snow White consented. But scarcely was the comb drawn through the hair when the poison began to work, and the maiden fell down senseless.
You pattern of beauty, it is now all over with you.
And so saying, she departed. Fortunately, evening soon came, and the 7 dwarfs returned, and as soon as they saw Snow White lying, like dead, upon the ground, they suspected the queen, and discovering the poison comb, they immediately drew it out. Then the maiden very soon revived and told them all that had happened. So again they warned her against the wicked stepmother, and bade her open the door to nobody. Meanwhile the queen, on her arrival home, had again consulted her mirror, and received the same answer as twice before. This made her tremble and foam with rage and jealousy, and she swore that Snow White should die if it cost her her own life. Thereupon she went into an inner secret chamber where no one could enter, and made an apple of the most deep and subtle poison. Outwardly it looked nice enough, and had rosy cheeks which would make the mouth of everyone who looked at it water, but whoever ate the smallest piece of it would surely die. As soon as the apple was ready, the queen again dyed her face, and clothed herself like a peasant's wife, and then over the 7 mountains to the house of the 7 dwarfs she made her way. She knocked at the door, and Snow White stretched out her head and said,
I dare not let anyone enter, the 7 dwarfs have forbidden me.
That is hard on me, for I must take back my apples, but there is one which I will give you.
No, no, I dare not take it.
What? Are you afraid of it? There, see, I will cut the apple in halves. Do you eat the red cheeks, and I will eat the core.
The apple was so artfully made that the red cheeks alone were poisoned. Snow White very much wished for the beautiful apple, and when she saw the woman eating the core she could no longer resist, but, stretching out her hand, took the poisoned part. Scarcely had she placed a piece in her mouth when she fell down dead upon the ground. Then the queen, looking at her with glittering eyes, and laughing bitterly, exclaimed,
White as snow, red as blood, black as ebony. This time the dwarfs cannot reawaken you.
When she reached home and consulted her mirror.
Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of us all?
It replied,
The queen is the fairest of the day.
Then her envious heart was at rest, as peacefully as an envious heart can rest. When the little dwarfs returned home in the evening, they found Snow White lying on the ground, and there appeared to be no life in her body. She seemed to be quite dead. They raised her up, and tried if they could find anything poisonous. They unlaced her, and even uncombed her hair, and washed her with water and with wine. But nothing availed, the dear child was really and truly dead. Then they laid her upon a bier, and all 7 placed themselves around it, and wept for 3 days without ceasing. Then they prepared to bury her. But she looked still fresh and lifelike, and even her red cheeks had not deserted her, so they said to one another,
We cannot bury her in the black ground.
Then they ordered a case to be made of glass. In this they could see the body on all sides, and the dwarfs wrote her name with golden letters upon the glass, saying that she was a king's daughter. Now they placed the glass case upon the ledge on a rock, and one of them always remained by it watching. Even the birds bewailed the loss of Snow White. First came an owl, then a raven, and last of all a dove. For a long time Snow White lay peacefully in her case, and changed not, but looked as if she were only asleep, for she was still white as snow, red as blood, and black-haired as ebony. By and by it happened that a king's son was traveling in the forest, and came to the dwarf's house to pass the night. He soon saw the glass case upon the rock, and the beautiful maiden lying within, and he read also the golden inscription. When he had examined it, he said to the dwarfs,
Let me have this case, and I will pay what you like for it.
But the dwarfs replied,
We will not sell it for all the gold in the world.
Then give it to me, for I cannot live without Snow White. I will honor and protect her as long as I live.
When the dwarfs saw that he was so much in earnest, they pitied him, and at last gave him the case, and the prince ordered it to be carried away on the shoulders of his attendants. Presently it happened that they stumbled over a rut, and with the shock the piece of poisoned apple which lay in Snow White's mouth fell out. Very soon she opened her eyes, and raising the lid of the glass case, she rose up and asked,
Where am I?
Full of joy, the prince answered,
you are safe with me.
And he told to her what she had suffered, and how he would rather have her than any other for his wife, and he asked her to accompany him home to the castle of the king his father. Snow White consented, and when they arrived there they were married with great splendor and magnificence. Snow White's stepmother was also invited to the wedding, and when she was dressed in all her finery to go, she first stepped in front of her mirror and asked,
Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of us all?
It replied,
The queen was fairest yesterday. The prince's bride is now, they say.
At these words the queen was in a fury, and was so terribly mortified that she knew not what to do with herself. At first she resolved not to go to the wedding, but she could not resist the wish to see the princess. So she went, but as soon as she saw the bride she recognized Snow White, and was so terrified with rage and astonishment that she rushed out of the castle and was never heard of again.
Thumbelina. A long time ago and far, far away, an old woman was sitting in her rocking chair thinking how happy she would be if she had a child. Then, she heard a knock at the door and opened it. A lady was standing there and she said,
If you let me in, I will grant you a wish.
The old woman let the woman in, firstly because she felt pity, secondly because she knew what she'd wish for, a child. After she washed the lady up and fed her, she saw that she was really beautiful. The lady slept soundly all night long, and then right before she left, she said,
Now, about your wish. What do you want?
The lady thought about most people's wishes: to be richest in the world, most powerful person, the smartest, and the prettiest. But the old woman wished for something the lady could not believe. She said,
I would like a child.
What did you say?
She asked because she was astonished at what the old lady asked for. The old lady repeated what she said.
I would like a child.
The lady then placed a tiny seed in the old woman's hand and gave her instructions.
Plant this seed, water it carefully, watch over it, and give it your love. If you do all those things, then you will have a child.
So the old woman did all of those things the lady had told her to. In a week, there was a beautiful yellow flower in place of the seed. The next day, the flower bloomed. Inside the flower was a beautiful little girl who was the size of the woman's thumb, so she called her Thumbelina. She made her a little dress out of golden threads. Thumbelina slept in a walnut shell and brought the old woman joy and happiness. But, one day when Thumbelina went down for her nap, a frog hopped through the open window and said,
You will be a perfect bride for my son.
And she took Thumbelina to a lily pad and hopped off to find her son. Thumbelina cried, and some little guppies heard her and chewed the roots off the lily pad to help her escape. Thumbelina's lily pad floated away. A few hours later, she finally stopped floating. During the summer, she ate berries and drank the dew off the leaves. But then winter came and she needed shelter. A kindly mouse let her stay with it, but it said,
You'll have to marry my friend, Mole, because I cannot keep you for another winter.
The next day she went to see Mole. In one of tunnels, she found a sick bird and said,
Poor thing, I will bury it.
Then she found out that it was still alive and she cared for it until it was ready to fly. It flew off. That fall she nearly had to marry Mole. But then she heard a familiar tweet and an idea popped up in the bird's head.
You can come down to the warm country,
said the bird, so Thumbelina hopped on the bird's back and flew to the warm country. The people there who were like her renamed her Erin. She married a prince and she lived happily ever after.
Rapunzel. There was once a man and a woman who had long in vain wished for a child. These people had a little window at the back of their house from which a splendid garden could be seen, which was full of the most beautiful flowers and herbs. It was, however, surrounded by a high wall, and no one dared to go into it because it belonged to an enchantress, who had great power and was dreaded by all the world. One day the woman was standing by this window and looking down into the garden, when she saw a bed which was planted with the most beautiful salad rampion, also known as Rapunzel, and it looked so fresh and green that she longed for it. She quite pined away, and began to look pale and miserable. Then her husband was alarmed, and asked,
What ails you, dear wife?
If I can't eat some of the rampion, which is in the garden behind our house, I shall die.
She replied. The man, who loved her, thought,
Sooner than let your wife die, bring her some of the rampion yourself, let it cost what it will.
At twilight, he clambered down over the wall into the garden of the enchantress, hastily clutched a handful of rampion, and took it to his wife. She at once made herself a salad of it, and ate it greedily. It tasted so good to her, so very good, that the next day she longed for it 3 times as much as before. If he was to have any rest, her husband must once more descend into the garden. In the gloom of evening therefore, he let himself down again, but when he had clambered down the wall he was terribly afraid, for he saw the enchantress standing before him.
How can you dare descend into my garden and steal my rampion like a thief? You shall suffer for it.
Let mercy take the place of justice. I only made up my mind to do it out of necessity. My wife saw your rampion from the window, and felt such a longing for it that she would have died if she had not got some to eat.
Then the enchantress allowed her anger to be softened, and said to him,
If the case be as you say, I will allow you to take away with you as much rampion as you will, only I make one condition, you must give me the child which your wife will bring into the world, it shall be well treated, and I will care for it like a mother.
The man in his terror consented to everything, and when the woman was brought to bed, the enchantress appeared at once, gave the child the name of Rapunzel, and took it away with her. Rapunzel grew into the most beautiful child under the sun. When she was 12 years old, the enchantress shut her into a tower, which lay in a forest, and had neither stairs nor door, but quite at the top was a little window. When the enchantress wanted to go in, she placed herself beneath it and cried,
Rapunzel, Rapunzel! Let down your hair to me!
Rapunzel had magnificent long hair, fine as spun gold, and when she heard the voice of the enchantress she unfastened her braided tresses, wound them round one of the hooks of the window above, and then the hair fell 20 ells down, and the enchantress climbed up by it. After a year or two, it came to pass that the king's son rode through the forest and passed by the tower. Then he heard a song, which was so charming that he stood still and listened. This was Rapunzel, who in her solitude passed her time in letting her sweet voice resound. The king's son wanted to climb up to her, and looked for the door of the tower, but none was to be found. He rode home, but the singing had so deeply touched his heart, that every day he went out into the forest and listened to it. Once when he was thus standing behind a tree, he saw that an enchantress came there, and he heard how she cried,
Rapunzel, Rapunzel! Let down your hair to me.
Then Rapunzel let down the braids of her hair, and the enchantress climbed up to her.
If that is the ladder by which one mounts, I too will try my fortune,
said he, and the next day when it began to grow dark, he went to the tower and cried,
Rapunzel, Rapunzel! Let down your hair to me.
Immediately the hair fell down and the king's son climbed up. At first Rapunzel was terribly frightened when a man, such as her eyes had never yet beheld, came to her, but the king's son began to talk to her quite like a friend, and told her that his heart had been so stirred that it had let him have no rest, and he had been forced to see her. Then Rapunzel lost her fear, and when he asked her if she would take him for her husband, and she saw that he was young and handsome, she thought,
He will love me more than old Dame Gothel does.
And she said yes, and laid her hand in his. She said,
I will willingly go away with you, but I do not know how to get down. Bring with you a skein of silk every time that you come, and I will weave a ladder with it, and when that is ready I will descend, and you will take me on your horse.
They agreed that until that time he should come to her every evening, for the old woman came by day. The enchantress remarked nothing of this, until once Rapunzel said to her,
Tell me, Dame Gothel, how it happens that you are so much heavier for me to draw up than the young king's son. He is with me in a moment.
Ah! You wicked child, what do I hear you say? I thought I had separated you from all the world, and yet you have deceived me.
In her anger she clutched Rapunzel's beautiful tresses, wrapped them twice round her left hand, seized a pair of scissors with the right, and snip, snap, they were cut off, and the lovely braids lay on the ground. And she was so pitiless that she took poor Rapunzel into a desert where she had to live in great grief and misery. On the same day that she cast out Rapunzel, however, the enchantress fastened the braids of hair, which she had cut off, to the hook of the window, and when the king's son came and cried,
Rapunzel, Rapunzel! Let down your hair to me.
She let the hair down. The king's son ascended, but instead of finding his dearest Rapunzel, he found the enchantress, who gazed at him with wicked and venomous looks.
Aha! You would fetch your dearest, but the beautiful bird sits no longer singing in the nest. The cat has got it, and will scratch out your eyes as well. Rapunzel is lost to you, you will never see her again.
The king's son was beside himself with pain, and in his despair he leapt down from the tower. He escaped with his life, but the thorns into which he fell pierced his eyes. Then he wandered quite blind about the forest, ate nothing but roots and berries, and did naught but lament and weep over the loss of his dearest wife. Thus he roamed about in misery for some years, and at length came to the desert where Rapunzel, with the twins to which she had given birth, a boy and a girl, lived in wretchedness. He heard a voice, and it seemed so familiar to him that he went towards it, and when he approached, Rapunzel knew him and fell on his neck and wept. 2 of her tears wetted his eyes and they grew clear again, and he could see with them as before. He led her to his kingdom where he was joyfully received, and they lived for a long time afterwards, happy and contented.